Human history is not a smooth upward climb. It is not a steady line from ignorance to mastery, from crude beginnings to modern sophistication. When you look closely at the record, when you stop summarizing it and start examining it, you see something else entirely. You see advances followed by collapse. You see knowledge that appears suddenly, works flawlessly, and then disappears. And you see long stretches of time where humanity seems to circle the same problems without ever quite touching the solutions that once existed. And this is not controversial. Archaeologists acknowledge it. Historians document it. Engineers encounter it every time they try to replicate certain ancient feats and quietly fail. What is rarely explored is why this pattern exists, why some capabilities appear fully formed, why they are not gradually improved upon, and why, once lost, they are never rediscovered in the same way again. This is not a story about hidden masters or shadow rulers. It is a story about human capability and the uncomfortable possibility that something essential was once understood, then forgotten. Not erased, not stolen, forgotten. When modern researchers discuss ancient engineering, the conversation almost always centers on tools. What tools did they have? What materials were available? What techniques could plausibly explain the outcome? That approach makes sense up to a point. But tools alone do not build monuments. Tools do not plan logistics. Tools do not design tolerances or standardize components across massive construction projects. Tools are expressions of knowledge, not the source of it. And when we examine certain ancient sites, the tools proposed by mainstream explanations do not align with the results we can still measure today. One of the most striking examples of this disconnect sits high on the Bolivian Altiplano, Puma Punku. At first glance, Puma Punku does not impress in the way other ancient sites do. There are no towering walls, no sweeping temples, no intact structures that overwhelm the senses. Instead, you see broken stone, scattered blocks, fragments, pieces of something that once fit together with deliberate precision. And that, paradoxically, is what makes Puma Punku so revealing. Because broken systems tell you how they were built in ways intact systems never can. The stone used at Puma Punku is not uniform. Some blocks are red sandstone, weighing several tons each. Others are andesite, an extremely hard volcanic stone that is notoriously difficult to shape even with modern equipment. This alone would not be remarkable. What is remarkable is how these stones were worked. Many of the blocks are not simply cut or flattened. They are machined in 3 dimensions. Edges meet at exact right angles. Grooves maintain consistent depth along their entire length. Interior corners are sharp, clean, precise. Some of these features exist inside the stone, not just on its surface. This matters because surface work can be rough. Interior geometry cannot. To create it, you must plan the entire form in advance. You must remove material in a controlled, sequential way. And you must do so without fracturing the stone. This is not guesswork. This is not trial and error. It is execution. Then there are the H blocks. Small enough to be handled individually, yet complex enough to demand forethought. These stones are nearly identical to one another. Not similar, not approximate. Identical. Their dimensions match. Their angles repeat. Their notches align. They were clearly designed as part of a modular system. Modularity is not a primitive concept. It is a systemic one. It assumes standardization. It assumes replacement. It assumes scalability. And most importantly, it assumes that the builders expected other people, perhaps generations later, to understand how the system worked. That expectation is not something you find in improvised construction. It is something you find in engineered systems. One common response to this observation is that the stones were cut carefully, one at a time, using simple tools and immense labor. But this explanation avoids the central question. Why repeat the same design over and over again if each stone is being handcrafted individually? Why impose strict uniformity if flexibility would have been easier? Why create a system that behaves like manufactured components if manufacturing did not exist? Handcrafted cultures celebrate variation. Engineered cultures eliminate it, Puma Punku shows elimination. The transport question complicates things further. The red sandstone blocks were quarried miles away. The andesite likely came from even farther. Moving stone of this mass across uneven terrain at high altitude is difficult under the best conditions. Doing it repeatedly with precision placement as the goal suggests planning far beyond brute force. This is not to say it was impossible. It is to say it was inefficient if simpler structures were the goal, which raises a quieter question. What if the structure itself was not the point? What if Puma Punku was not built to impress, but to function? The layout of the site does not resemble a conventional temple complex. There is no clear ceremonial axis, no obvious progression from outer to inner sanctum, no alignment that screams ritual necessity. Instead, the site appears fragmented, but not randomly so. It feels incomplete. Not destroyed in war, not abandoned mid-construction, but dismantled, as if its purpose had ended. This is where the idea of a missing step becomes unavoidable. Because Puma Punku does not sit at the beginning of a technological curve, it sits in the middle of one. Behind it must have been knowledge methods, organizational frameworks we no longer see. Ahead of it should have been refinement, expansion, replication. Instead, the curve drops. Later cultures in the region built impressive things, but not this. They stacked stone. They carved symbols. They created art. They did not reproduce Puma Punku's precision. This pattern is not unique to Bolivia. Across the ancient world, we find structures that do not fit neatly into the technological story told about their time. Stone joints so tight a blade cannot fit between them. Massive blocks placed with no obvious lifting mechanism. Materials cut in ways that defy the limitations of known tools. And then, silence. No instruction manuals, no gradual degradation, no transitional forms, just absence. One explanation is that these were isolated strokes of genius brief moments when exceptional individuals pushed the limits of what was possible. But genius does not standardize. Genius experiments. Puma Punku does not experiment. It repeats. Another explanation is that the knowledge was preserved by elites and later withheld or lost. This idea often gets framed poorly, as if it requires secret orders or conspiratorial intent. It does not. Human societies routinely lose knowledge when the structures that support it collapse. Libraries burn, languages die, training systems vanish. Knowledge does not need enemies to disappear. It only needs neglect. Which brings us briefly to Puabi. Puabi was not a builder. She did not quarry stone or shape andesite, but her burial tells us something important. She was interred with extraordinary precision, wealth, and symbolic care. The artifacts placed with her were not decorative improvisations. They were standardized, intentional, loaded with meaning. This tells us that elite knowledge systems existed in the ancient world systems that preserved information, practices, and status across generations. Not secrets. Continuity. If engineering knowledge once existed at a high level, it would not have been evenly distributed. It would have been taught selectively, maintained within structured lineages, lost when those lineages ended. This is not sinister, it is human. The uncomfortable implication is not that ancient people were more advanced than we are. It is that human progress is not guaranteed. Capabilities can vanish. Skills can disappear. Understanding can be lost so thoroughly that later generations mistake precision for magic. We are not immune to this. Modern society depends on layered systems so complex that no single individual understands them fully. Remove the infrastructure, break the chain of education, disrupt continuity, and future archaeologists may find our artifacts equally puzzling. Puma Punku does not demand belief in the impossible. It demands humility. It asks us to accept that our narrative of history may be incomplete, not because it is wrong, but because it is simplified. It asks us to consider that capability is fragile, that what humanity knows at one moment can slip through its fingers at the next, and that progress is not a ladder, it is a flame. It must be carried. The missing step is not a mystery to be solved with speculation. It is a gap to be acknowledged with honesty. Between crude stone tools and modern machinery, something existed, something organized, something repeatable, something precise. We may never recover it in full, but the stones are still there, quiet, patient, waiting for us to stop arguing about what should have been possible and start asking what clearly was. Because the idea that sites like Puma Punku were carved by hand with chicken bones is ridiculous. But that's what many mainstream archaeologists would have us believe.